Hello, everybody. Let's talk about A Game of Thrones, the first book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series by George R.R. Martin. Obviously, this is the book that HBO's Game of Thrones was based upon. This is the first book in a 7-book series. 5 books are out already, and there are 2 more left to come out. Hopefully, they'll come out soon. Obviously, this author has been taking his time with getting out his books. Let's talk about the first entry. This is an adult epic fantasy book that is set in a fictional universe. So I picked up A Game of Thrones after I watched the whole TV show. I was quite disappointed by the ending of the show. After the show, I was more inclined to pick up the books because coincidentally at that time I was also getting back into reading. So I ordered the books and I started reading A Game of Thrones, and let me just say, I really, really liked it. If you have seen my previous videos, you know this is my favorite book of 2019 that I read. This book is set in a very rich universe that the author has created, but I also feel like despite the fact that the world feels so real, it's not like there is so much focus on the world building that you don't get a lot of plot or character work in this book, because I feel like both the plot and the characters are amazing in this book. But I have to shout out the world building, which is done sometimes through descriptions, but oftentimes also through character work and also through inner thoughts of the characters. And by doing it that way, we not only get the story as we progress, but we also fill in the blanks of like what's happened in the recent past in this world, which is a really cool way to fill out all the blocks, like how this story works together, because you have to see this is a very, very complex story. I will go into more of the plot later on, but this is a very complex story, and we have a lot of different point of view characters. I think we have 8 main point of view characters that we follow in this book. What I really love about this book, and I feel like that's what makes this stand out so much, is the characters. We get a lot of great characters that seem like they are very real. They're very well thought out, and all the actions certain characters make are justified within their character. I feel like it's amazing how well everything in this book is thought out. Also, the plot of this book is quite interesting. This is basically the first book is a big setup for what is to come in the series, but it is still a very solid book in plot-wise in itself, and it really helps to build up a lot of the main characters that we will focus on in the later books. Also, the book expands a lot on what you have seen in the show, like certain things that are only revealed in the show in like the later seasons are already hinted at and set up in this book. And so I would highly recommend, if you have seen the show even, and if you haven't seen the show, check out the book, look if you like it. I know this isn't a book for everyone because it is quite dark. The characters go through some stuff that maybe not everybody will want to read, but I would still say it is a really, really good book. And if you like Game of Thrones, I think you will like the books as well. So let me just give you a short overview of the plot if you don't know what this is about. So basically this is set in a kind of medieval world. So we have different ruling houses that rule over different parts of this continent called Westeros. And in Westeros, we basically have a united realm that used to be 7 kingdoms in the past, but now it is 1 realm ruled by 1 king, and every one of those kingdoms has 1 great house. For a spoiler-free plot overview, I would say this is basically kind of like a murder mystery book, which is the main plot of this book. We find out in the beginning of this book that the Hand of the King, Jon Arryn, has died, and now one of our main characters, Eddard Stark, is the new Hand of the King, and he's trying to figure out how Jon Arryn died, because the way he died was kind of weird, and it has led to certain speculations that maybe it wasn't a natural death, but actually somebody ended up killing him. Eddard Stark, who's also called Ned, is trying to figure out how Jon Arryn died. Another point I would like to focus on in this book is the lore and the history of this world, because I feel like for the fact that this is the first book in this series, it seems like a lot of the lore and history has already been figured out. Like, we never have this, like, I would say info dump for pages where we see, oh yeah, that's the history of this world, but we always have some kind of references to past kings, to certain things that happened hundreds or even thousands of years ago. And yeah, it seems like this world is very, very built out already. This is quite interesting because this is the first book in the series. But yeah, it seems like this author already thought out a lot of his history and lore, and also a lot of the things in the history that will impact what will happen in the series already. I think the way he reveals his lore, the way he reveals the history of the world is very interesting, and I feel like it always adds to the current plot of the story. And yeah, so I personally really, really like this book. I would say I would recommend this to anybody, at least to try it out. I would say maybe you should be like at least 16 to read this book. I mean, if you're mature, you may be able to read it earlier. But yeah, for me personally, I'd say maybe 16 and up. For those people, it would be fitting to read this. And yeah, I personally really like this book. As I said, it's one of my favorite books of last year, and I would still argue this is one of my favorite books that I've read. And yeah, so I would recommend this to anybody. If you like the TV show Game of Thrones, if you were disappointed by the ending of the TV show, I would say check out the books. There are enough differences in the books. Like the first book is still pretty close to the first season of the show, but the other books diverge from the show more and more as you go on. So yeah, I would recommend this, but you should know there are still 2 books that are supposed to come out, and the author takes his time with his book, so there hasn't been a new book in 9 years. So just if you go into it, just know that maybe you won't get an ending to this story in the next few years probably. For me personally, I think these books are still worth reading, and I would highly recommend you read them. So yeah, I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. I think it's great. I think for an epic fantasy, this already shows a lot of like interesting hints to what we can expect will happen throughout the series. A lot of great character work. Like already, if you look at the characters at the start of the book and look at them at the end of the book, a lot of the characters are completely different. And also the whole like situation the world is in has completely shifted in this book. And as I said earlier, this book is basically a big setup for the other books. The way this book ends gives you a neat like wrap up of the main story of this book, but it also sets up the next book in such an interesting way that I feel like you will want to pick up the next book immediately. Alright, I will jump into spoilers for a bit now. There will be a timestamp that will be on the screen right now that you can click on to go to my final thoughts. But yeah, I will go into spoilers now, so if you haven't read the book, either skip to the timestamp or turn this video off. Alright, so now let's talk a little bit about spoilers. As I said in the spoiler-free section, I love this book. I do think a lot of the characters are amazing. I really liked most of the POVs. I didn't like one POV, but I think that was supposed to be like that. Like, well, I'm talking about Sansa. I feel like her POV was kind of annoying. And her view on the world is kind of very naive and superficial, but I feel like that's what her character is. And since I've already read the next few books, I can see that all of this was a big setup to take her character in a certain direction. So I feel like in hindsight it was good, but yeah, I had a few issues with the Sansa point of view chapters in this book, but yeah, there aren't a lot of those, so it's not a big issue. But I personally just didn't enjoy reading them as much as I enjoyed all the other ones. Then the Arya point of view was quite interesting, I feel like seeing her relationship with Jon, seeing her relationship with her father. And yeah, I feel like it was really interesting to see the world through Arya's eyes, because while we get this like view through Ned, Cat, and Sansa's eyes, like how usually nobles see this world, Arya's point of view is quite different. And yeah, I really liked her as a character. Obviously by the end of the book, her arc is going in a very sad direction. Maybe she goes through a lot in this book, but I personally really, really liked her POV. Related to those two, my favorite POV of this book is Eddard. And I feel like Ned's chapters in this book are amazing. From the start, you get a lot of I would say you get like this conflicted mindset of Ned. that already when Robert asks him to become the Hand of the King, he isn't quite sure whether he should do that. He also sometimes get these like sequences from his past where we see that already in his past he has some things that he's conflicted about and may not be proud about, but still, despite all that, he is a very noble, and yeah, you could argue maybe he is also a quite naive person and not really suited for these like politics and these and the, like literal the Game of Thrones of this world. I think Ned as a character is very interesting. He's a very likable character compared to a lot of the different other characters in this universe. I feel like Ned's POV in this book is incredible. I have argued a lot of times, like after reading the second book, that the second book didn't have as many issues as the first one, but I feel like Ned's POV is what makes A Game of Thrones stand above A Clash of Kings, which is book 2. Ned's chapters are amazing. It's amazing to see how he slowly figures out what is happening. Obviously we as the audience have already kind of know what is going on with Cersei and Jaime. So we kind of already have figured out why Jon Arryn maybe died. But we can still see like Ned putting it all together and trying to find it out. But yeah, at the end of the day, he loses his head for it and starts this like chain reaction that starts basically a war. It's crazy. I feel like half of this book is actually interesting because now that I've read more, all the other books are quite dark, but I would say the first half of this book is still like very light, especially what's happening in Westeros, because at that point this whole war hasn't started yet. The fact that Eddard finds out about Jaime and Cersei is what ends up getting him arrested, and that's what sets off all the chain reactions to what is happening. Essentially, Robert dies, Ned gets arrested, and then because of Ned's arrest, Robb Stark calls all his banners and starts basically a war against House Lannister. That's basically the seed that changes the whole situation that Westeros is in. And I feel like Eddard being a catalyst for that is quite an interesting story. Obviously, since I had seen the show, I knew where his arc was going. But I have to say, the scene where he dies, it still gets me. It's very, very sad, especially getting it from his daughter's POV is quite sad. So even when I'm reading the other books, I'm sad that we don't have these Eddard chapters anymore, because Eddard's chapters were quite interesting, and I really loved him as a character. I feel like his POVs just had like even some flashback sequences where he dreams about certain things that happened in the past, which obviously gives hints to things later on. His mindset about how he views his family, how he views his role as a lord, and I feel like Ned is an amazing character, and yeah, his character is something that still, despite the fact that he dies in this book, it still impacts so many different characters in all the other books. Like, obviously his children are some of the main characters in these books. His character is really what establishes a lot of the different characters in this book, which is quite amazing. So this was the King's Landing plot. Now let's talk a little bit about the plot that's happening in Winterfell and Riverrun and everything. So yeah, we see Bran, who's climbing a tower and finds out about Cersei and Jaime. What happens then is Jaime just shoves him out of a window to kill him, basically, but we see that Bran survives. Yeah, I mean, that whole sequence is, I guess, it's quite hard to read. Like, I feel like that's like the first shock moment that you get in this book. Obviously, you could argue the prologue is a shock value. I would say Bran getting shoved out of the window is what really gets you and is like, oh, this author is not going to pull any punches. Yeah, we find out that he didn't die from this fall, which is already a miracle, but then we see an assassin that's trying to kill him. And yeah, his wolf essentially kills that assassin, and his mother stops the assassin from killing him. And that sets off Catelyn, who is his mother, to try and find out who did this, who wanted Bran dead, and why they wanted Bran dead. So that sets off Catelyn in a direction where she goes to King's Landing to tell Ned about this. And yeah, we get the like final interaction between Kat and Ned, which was also quite sad in hindsight. Like as I said, I read this after watching the show, so reading that scene was already again. It was quite emotional to read the scene, knowing that these characters won't meet again. So yeah, and then obviously Kat, while on the way back to Winterfell, she runs into Tyrion Lannister and arrests him, which sets off another thing. I personally really liked the interactions between Kat and Tyrion, which it was quite interesting, but obviously that's another catalyst for how the war that we see in the end of the book is developing. Kat, obviously, she is also a complex character. Like you see, like her motivations are probably good, but you also see like the things she does are quite short-sighted, and also yeah, they lead to bigger problems down the road. But yeah, I still think Kat's POV is quite interesting. I have to say, so apart from Sansa's POV, my biggest issue was in Kat's POV, because so some of those scenes where she is like just wandering around were a bit weird. So the one that stood out to me the most is the scene where she goes to the Eyrie. So after she arrests Tyrion, she takes him to the Eyrie to her sister Lysa, and then we get a chapter where she has to go up to the Eyrie, which is obviously set on top of mountains, and we get the scene where she rides a mule, and that scene goes on for a few pages, which to me felt a bit weird. So that was the only point in this book where I felt like, what is happening here? Like, why are we reading about it? Because literally it felt like it was like she gets on the mule, they ride a bit, then she describes the steps. The steps are a bit broken, so they have to be careful. Then they change mules, then she talks a bit to this person who is helping her go up. Then we again get a few descriptions of the steps, what's happening on the road. And I felt like that went on for like 5 pages, 6 pages, which was a bit, yeah, boring. But yeah, that's the only boring chapter I would say in this book. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh here, but yeah, that's the only thing where I would say it got a bit jarring. That might also be because this is the first epic fantasy book I read, and I'm just not used to getting these like descriptions of travel. So maybe that was it. Maybe that was the big issue that I had. But yeah, obviously after she goes to the Eyrie, we get the whole trial scene with Tyrion and Bronn, and Tyrion is set free again. But because Kat arrested Tyrion, obviously the war starts, one in King's Landing, where Jaime Lannister attacks Ned, and also we get the start of the war in the West and also in the Riverlands. Yeah, so again, this is a catalyst for the war that's happening. Yeah, and then we also obviously get the Tyrion chapters, which are very interesting. Tyrion is, I would say, probably my second favorite POV in this book, because Tyrion is a very interesting character. Obviously, he's a dwarf, but he's still from a great house. And it's really interesting to see the world from Tyrion's perspective. Like, he's a very witty character. He's a very unusual character for this kind of story, I feel like. But yeah, he's a really smart character too. And in this book, we really get a big setup to see that, yeah, he is quite smart. And we also get to see him interacting with a few different characters. So yeah, in the beginning of this book, we get to see him interacting with his family, so his siblings and yeah, Cersei's children. But then what is one of my favorite passages of this book is his interactions with Jon Snow. One during the feast in Winterfell, where he talks to Jon Snow. Yeah, that interaction was really, really good. And then I also liked their whole thing where they were going to the wall, and then also like all their scenes at the wall were quite interesting. And I felt like there is a relationship that developed there, and it is something that could be brought back up later on in the books. Yeah, I really like that. Then we get a nice scene with Tyrion when he comes back to Winterfell, and yeah, has this nice scene with Bran, and already some friction with Robb. And then obviously he runs into Kat on his way back. Then we get the whole Eyrie storyline, and he escapes from there. And then we get the big battle in the Whispering Wood. So what the situation is, Ned has been arrested in King's Landing. Tywin has raised his host, has come basically into the Riverlands, and Robb Stark has called his banners and is marching down to the Riverlands. We get this like battle at the Whispering Woods. We get one battle with Tywin Lannister and part of Robb Stark's host, but the major part of Robb Stark's host actually fights a battle against Jaime Lannister and his host, and they manage to capture Jaime Lannister. And yeah, I really like the way that was written, and I liked how Robb's character was written as well. Like, we see he's quite a young person who's fighting a war, but we can see that he is already quite smart in the way he organizes his battles. But then obviously towards the end of the book, we find out that Ned Stark has been killed, and we get the reaction from Cat and Robb, which is quite sad. I might be mixing up a little bit now the scene in the show and the scene in the book, but yeah, either way, both scenes were really sad, like seeing these characters find out about the fact that Ned, who is Cat's husband and Robb's father, died, and also seeing like Bran finding out. Yeah, so that was quite quite a sad thing to see. So yeah, at the end of the book, we have this whole setup of Ned is dead, Arya escapes with Yoren, who is from the Night's Watch. Sansa is stuck in King's Landing and is captured basically by the Lannisters. But we get a really, really cool chapter, which is the last Catelyn chapter in this book, which is amazing, where Robb Stark is crowned the king in the North, and the North decides that they want to be independent again, like they used to be. So Robb Stark is now crowned the king, and now we all obviously have this like setup for a war in the second book. So yeah, and I feel like the way that scene where Robb is crowned is written is amazing. It's one of my favorite scenes. It's a scene that I really like in the TV show too. Like, I sometimes even still go back and watch that scene. It's really, really good. And yeah, that whole scene, obviously it's the last Catelyn chapter and the second last chapter in this book. It just sets up the whole like story that where we're going in the next book, despite the fact that we had this like huge letdown at the end that Ned dies. We get this like slight upturn towards the end, which is quite nice. So the Daenerys plot is essentially a very, you could say, a side plot. Like, the main plot of this book is really set in the Seven Kingdoms, and the Daenerys plot can be sometimes a bit, I wouldn't say boring, but it feels like it's just a different plot line altogether, because she doesn't interact a lot with the people who are in Westeros, apart from the fact that Robert Baratheon, who is the king, is trying to get her killed essentially, but doesn't succeed. So yeah, but I feel like her arc is quite interesting in this, because it is a whole arc where we see her go through some very bad stuff, get some comeuppance, and then we see her go through some bad stuff again, and then in the end we see her being desperate and just doing something that she feels is right but seems really crazy, and yeah, that pays off at the end. And yeah, so I feel like this is amazing, because the last like passage of this book is, and for the first time in hundreds of years, the night came alive with the music of dragons, which is such, and this is the last sentence of this book, which is such an amazing way to set up the next book, I feel like. So we get this whole like setup of the king in the north with Robb, and then we get the setup of this whole like dragon hatching thing with Daenerys, and that really sets up an interesting arc for the next books. I feel like, again, Dany, I wouldn't say her POV is my favorite, but I do think it is still quite good. So for me, the top 3 POVs in this book were probably Ned, Tyrion, and Cat. Yeah, Ned, Tyrion, and Cat are the main POVs that I really liked. I would also shout out Bran, because again, he is also one that he is basically in Winterfell, and he is where we get a view on what's happening in the north and how they're reacting to what's happening in King's Landing. But with Bran, we also get these hints of him having psychic dreams and him having magical abilities. So yeah, those are also interesting. But I feel like at the end of the day, this book, it sets up a lot of stuff for this series. We get a lot of characters, we get a lot of different plot lines. There are a lot of characters that I didn't even go into in this. But yeah, so there's so much to dive into in this book. There's so much complex plot and character work happening in this book. And yeah, I feel like the way all of this is set up is amazing. And I think I would highly recommend everybody to read this book if you're interested in an epic fantasy. Yeah, I feel like this series has been amazing. I've worked my way through the first 3 books. I am reading the 4th book currently, and yeah, I'm really, really enjoying it. As I said, A Game of Thrones gets 5 out of 5 stars from me. So yeah, check out this book if you have seen the show, if you haven't seen the show, if you like the show, if you didn't like the ending of the show, I would highly recommend you read this. That's my review for it. I think this will be pretty long. I'll see how far I can edit it down. But yeah, so let me know what you think of A Game of Thrones down below in the comment section, and I will talk to you there. If you like this video, leave a like, leave a subscribe. I hope you liked this video. If you did, click on some of the videos that should have popped up on the screen right now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.